Hello and welcome to Global Review. I am Sachin Chaturvedi and you are watching our weekly show Global Review, where we bring to you weekly analysis of key developments. But today's show is very special. We have dedicated it to all the key achievements of 2018, what initiatives we took in India's foreign policy. The issues are also being analyzed from the point of view of how regional, sub-regional, multilateral and global institutions were touched by India, by Indian leaders, and in what way we came out with some norm setting for our own foreign policy making. But let's first have a look at this report.
The President, Vice President, Prime Minister and External Affairs Minister collectively undertook 73 foreign visits in 2018, covering 58 countries across the globe. Simultaneously, India also received leaders from 37 countries and the UN spread over 44 visits. Engagement with neighborhood was clear, with 47% of the visits to Asian countries. Focus on South-South cooperation was all the more evident, with 18% of the visits to Africa and 8% to Latin America and the rest 27% to Europe and North America. The figures show a substantial focus of India's foreign policy towards developing regions of the world. Prime Minister Modi declared Africa as India's top priority in his tour to Africa across Uganda, Rwanda and South Africa ahead of the BRICS summit and declared a 10-point policy plan of India's engagement with Africa. Prime Minister Modi strengthened India's development cooperation effort in Africa by extending multiple lines of credit and grants to various nations. In Latin America, India's engagement came with 6 visits to 6 countries, including Prime Minister's visit to Argentina for the G20 summit, where he engaged with leaders of the Latin American countries. He also met Chinese President Xi Jinping over the sidelines. This was the 4th meeting of the Indian and Chinese head of states after the Wuhan SCO BRICS summit, signaling an important improvement in India-China relations. India-China recently held the first meeting of high-level people-to-people exchange mechanism in New Delhi. India-Russia annual summit in October resulted in the signing of agreements for space, nuclear energy and railway cooperation. The first ever US-India 2+2 dialogue in 2018 led to the signing of COMCASA, a military communication pact and cooperation on India's bid for nuclear suppliers group. Bilateral visits also focused on extending lines of credit of $100 million to Mauritius and $100 million to Vietnam. To boost Madagascar's agricultural sector, India offered a financial assistance of $80.7 million. MOUs were signed with Vietnam, Myanmar, Greece, Guyana to name a few. India also ramped up its multilateral collaboration significantly by hosting the Secretary General of the United Nations and President of the General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, within the span of 2 months and convening the first ever General Assembly of the International Solar Alliance. In the commemorative spirit of Mahatma Gandhi's 150th birth anniversary, music artists from 124 countries paid homage in the form of a collective song produced by the Ministry of External Affairs as a symbol of India's cultural and soft power, named Vaishnav Janto.
(2018) was extremely important for Indian foreign policy. It was continuing the broad trend started in 2014 with focus on 3 C's, culture, commerce, connectivity, but also brought in heft in terms of how India is engaging with multilateral and regional platforms. India's partnership at G20 also brought out several important milestones. The focus also continued in terms of leveraging India's external connect with domestic economic growth priorities. Prime Minister could bring in technology, could hold the Scandinavian countries summit, also could bring in broad 10 principles to engage with Africa. He also emphasized on International Solar Alliance. The idea of bringing in Neighbourhood First continued to be the top priority. Several of these issues we would discuss in this program, and I'm joined in the studio by a very eminent panel. We are joined in by Professor Sreeram Chaulia, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, and of course Harsh Pant. All the three are extremely eminent commentators on international affairs. Sreeram, let me start with you. What are the broad milestones you see, and then we would pick up the details?
I think, Sachin, 2018, one of the big readjustments we did was in terms of the major power relations. The Wuhan summit, which our report just mentioned, was, I think, pivotal, very, very central diplomatic highlight of the year, in my view, because we wanted to stabilize what had become a very rocky relationship with China. And I think we have also been able to rethink the value and the importance of the United States for our own rise in light of the drift caused by Trump administration policies. At the same time, we still try to salvage this important relationship. The 2+2 dialogue was very critical too, and Comcasa agreement took us closer in a strategic way to the US. And I think even with Russia, we stood our ground. You remember there was a lot of pressure on us not to buy the S-400 anti-missile system, but Prime Minister Modi and President Putin did it. So we asserted our autonomy in many ways against all these great power pressures. And simultaneously, I think the neighborhood, and if you see the Asia focus, as we see in the graphs and the of the overall visits, the Asia, we showed that we have a strategic priority of Indo-Pacific and our own neighborhood, and where we have influence and where we need to expand our influence. So in terms of the priorities, and the last thing I want to mention is the usage of President, Vice President, Lok Sabha Speaker. Just imagine 73 visits we are saying of between President, Vice President, Prime Minister and External Affairs Minister overseas. That's phenomenal. That means we are showing our omnipresence, and we are taking foreign affairs more seriously. People said this is the election year and Prime Minister will somehow downgrade this and focus on domestic. But I think we have consistently shown that now we have reached a certain level of global engagement. We cannot let go and decelerate now. So
exactly.
even with elections coming up, we are focusing on continuous presence and showing our presence, and that matters. High level presence matters. So if you see the President, Vice President also, their visits, Venkaiah ji has been to 11 countries in the last 1.5 years. Ramnath Kovind ji has done 17 countries, and these are not ceremonial or symbolic ones anymore. Prime Minister has given them a kind of a push to achieve substantial. For example, you look at a country like Mauritius, which just mentioned. Mauritius, Ramnath Kovind ji went there at a time when they were saying there's a difficulty with this Agalega, the island which we were supposed to develop for defense. And he went and announced a defense package there, President of India. So to see President, Prime Minister, Lok Sabha Speaker, along with External Affairs, all of them, it's like a team India really. We made a big effort in foreign policy.
Ambassador Mukherjee, how you see the broad milestones, both in multilateral but also in bilateral, how they have been feeding in each other, and what kind of key outcomes you see for the year?
Well, I think if you look at it in the broad multilateral context, this has been a year of challenge for a country like India, which is a founder of the multilateral system. And I think that by demonstrating, as Professor Chaulia just said, our ability to extract the maximum out of each of our bilateral engagements, especially with the so-called great powers, the permanent members of the Security Council, we have positioned ourselves to be now counted among the advocates for international cooperation. The threat today to multilateralism and to the multilateral system is coming from assertive unilateralism, especially from the Trump administration, which is walking away from so many of the institutions that have been created by the United States after the Second World War, that there has to be some kind of coalition of countries which will reassert the principles of international cooperation. For India today, and that takes us to the bilateral, for India today, international cooperation is of critical importance, because unlike in the past, today India's economy has tremendous international exposure. 40% of our GDP is contributed by international trade. So you cannot expect India now to become part of an isolationist trend in international relations. We have to be there, we have to lead, and I think that, as has been mentioned by your report and by Professor Chaulia, the fact that there is a team India at work which is strengthening these alliances, strengthening the bilateral relationships, is also meant to position India on the world stage. And I think it's a good...
Professor Pant, 2 points have emerged. One, Professor Chaulia's point that India asserted autonomy. And as Ambassador Mukherjee said, the delicate balancing, particularly in terms of bringing in focus on how India walks that tightrope in balancing various interests at the multilateral platform. How you see these two major milestones for our 2018 year?
Sachin, I think it was very fascinating to see what happened, for example, at the G20 this year. On the one hand, India was engaging at the Quad level with the 4 countries of Japan, Australia, US, and of course New Delhi, in coming together and articulating the vision for the Quad forward. At the same time, having a trilateral with the Russians and the Chinese, which I think exemplifies the challenge and the opportunity that India has at this point in terms of articulating a new role for itself. And a new, perhaps a global architecture, whereas as Ambassador Mukherjee was pointing out, international cooperation for India is essential if it wants to see its developmental needs being put front and center. And I think therefore the way India has articulated it over the last year is very, very important. If you look at Mr. Modi's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, for example, it was an interesting speech because it came as a counter to some of the more exclusivist positions that perhaps were emanating from some quarters. And the idea was that, look, we are looking at China as a country that cannot be excluded from the Indo-Pacific, but if we are going to work towards a certain kind of an architecture in the region, then certain clear red lines need to be drawn, certain kinds of engagement need to be pursued. And I think that is a message that India has been consistent in giving out. So whether it is engaging with Russians and the Chinese and as Sreeram pointed out, asserting its autonomy, or whether taking forward its approach with America and with other like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, saying that, look, certain rules of the game have to be followed by China. So I think that is perhaps a good position for India to be in.
And I think you mentioned very important point in terms of how trilateral partnerships have come up. We saw India, Japan and US. We saw IPSA, first Sherpas meeting happened. And of course, then China, Russia and India. How you see trilaterals coming up in a major way?
I think trilaterals have become a very important part of India's external engagement today. And I think if you look at even in Asia, or for example, the IPSA that you point out, we are looking at more such arrangements to further our interests in a world that is becoming very, very fractious. So I think where big multilateral platforms may be very daunting, more cohesive, more focused trilateral approaches perhaps are a better way of gaining traction on certain kinds of issues.
Great. We would stop here for a break. Don't go away. Many more points would be coming up. Welcome back. We were discussing rise of trilateralism and how India is going to move this way. Mr. Mukherjee, how you see these policy choices that India has very consciously made and has done adversarial partners part of the larger journey that India is on?
Well, I think that the trilateral frameworks that have emerged demonstrate a building block for India to assume a position which it has always articulated and aspired for, which is leadership in the international community. If you look at, for example, the trilateral within the Quad, I would say that the most potential and the most significant trilateral within that is the India-Japan US trilateral. And particularly so because India and Japan have more or less a similar view on the Indo-Pacific.
That's right.
And for both the countries, the Indo-Pacific is a holistic concept, and Japan has been willing to put its money into implementing this concept. Similarly, in the trilateral India, Russia, China, this is a very interesting trilateral because it now throws open possibilities for India to take initiatives on the Asian platform, which so far India has not really been very active on. I mean, we became members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, full members, and our Prime Minister attended the summit, and that is one part of it. But I think that the bigger picture is going to happen in the next few years in the conference for confidence building in Asia, SICA. India has been a founder member of SICA, but India has not been very active so far in that. But the trilateral that India engages with between Russia, China and India will bring forward for India a very interesting leadership position in an Asian security architecture.
And Mr. Mukherjee, you referred to Japan-India partnership. how you view that in context of ASEAN, particularly when we talk about the East Asia Summit process and Prime Minister's commitment for RCEP. How you view that as an emerging factor in 2019?
Well, I think when we look at the India-Japan relationship within the East Asia framework, one issue which I think is very important for both India and Japan is that neither of us have the luxury of land connectivity. We, for example, both our economies depend on energy supplies, and for both of us, energy has to come from the maritime domain.
That's right.
So that brings India and Japan closely together in the maritime domain, and that has resulted on the ground or in the maritime domain in looking at ASEAN as being central to both our aspirations.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that will have a tremendous resonance in the way the Indo-Pacific concept is being implemented, because for both India and Japan, it's not only the sea lanes of communication through the South China Sea that are important, but equally important are the energy sea lanes of communication, especially through the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandab, which transport so much of Japanese trade. So India and Japan will work together in ensuring free and open navigation, not only in one part of the Indo-Pacific, but in the entire Indo-Pacific, especially in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the priority which has been put in your report, which our Prime Minister and our President have articulated, of Africa. This is an opportunity for India and Japan actually to make a difference in the approach and the development of Africa, with a priority, I would say, towards East and Central Africa.
That's right. And there, the whole idea of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which was released by Prime Minister during AFDB meeting in Ahmedabad, has paved way in terms of how both Japan and India can move forward and private sector can leverage the advantage of this. I would say come back to you on issues related to UN reforms, but Sreeram, tell us something about how the Europeans figure in this year, where the Prime Minister was there, of course, in the Scandinavian summit, and we had the opportunity of interacting with almost all the Nordic countries. How you see, then the Norwegian Prime Minister would be here in the first week of January itself. How you see?
I think our goal is very clear, Sachin, because given the geographical distance and the power projection limitations of the Europeans, it's not so much of a geopolitical relationship as a kind of a softer one, which is focused on economic development and growth, and to continue to attract investment. And Prime Minister has been very successful. Even this year, 2018 is a record year for inward FDI.
Yeah.
We have received more than $61 billion. It's the second highest after China. So, and it's consistently been that way with Prime Minister Modi for the last 4 years, since he came to power.
Yeah.
So, with the Europeans, I think we continue to woo them for capital, for investment, to show India as a place where they can get good return on investment. And also, I think at one level, this part which was mentioned earlier about how to keep the global order intact, especially uphold the multilateral processes and institutions. For example, Iran is a good example. This year, as you know, Trump administration slapped sanctions and revoked the Iran nuclear deal. And we were in a kind of a quandary as to what to do. Now, the Europeans and we have something in common there, where both of us want to preserve this deal for the sake of stability, and also because India has strategic interests in Chabahar port for our long-term plans with Central Asia. So the Europeans are devising a special purpose vehicle to bypass the US sanctions and continue to have trade with Iran. And likewise, we should be able to join hands with the Europeans on these kinds of matters. So Asia, Europe, there is a bit of a convergence on these kind of issues to stabilize these regions. Even if Afghanistan, one of the big worry factors right now for Indian foreign policy, this year the security situation has worsened a lot, and there is a pretty good danger that Taliban control will increase and expand like anything with the US drawdown. So in that kind of situation, there are some European players which are part of the NATO coalition, and they are wondering now what will they do if the US is going to withdraw. So then, therefore, I think we need to coordinate more with the Europeans on areas of convergence, especially this Eurasian landmass, which is the intermediate space between India and the European landmass.
Do you think, Sreeram, this idea of triangular development partnerships, which Prime Minister Modi has given a new life to? We tried that way back in 50s and early 60s in terms of partnering with another country in third country. This model was time tested, but Prime Minister Modi, after coming back to power, defined in terms of how we go beyond equator to get into these partnerships. We, in fact, with China, after Wuhan, as you rightly mentioned, we entered in Afghanistan, initially for capacity building, but then with development projects. Same we are doing, as Ambassador Mukherjee mentioned, in Africa with Japan. With European Union, we have yet to discuss formally what kind of possibilities are there. Of course, during Prime Minister's visit for Commonwealth to UK, issues did come up, and PM very positively responded to India's partnership with UK in Africa along with Commonwealth.
Well, I think there are ideas that there can be like a G9 or a G10 or G11 comprising Canada and the European countries and some developing countries that have an interest in fostering this multilateral rules based order. So those kind of things, I don't know whether it will come to fruition, but the north south idea, Sachin, which is I think a very attractive one for a country like India, because we are not an LDC, but we have some capacities, but we don't have the financing which a northern country can bring in. So leveraging those kind of things, the trainings we have done for Afghan diplomats with China is a good start. With the Europeans and even with Canada or even with the US in some instances.
With Russia, we have discussed
with the Russians, we are
in Central Asian countries.
So in space, for example, we are going to now partner with Russia for our unmanned, for our manned space mission that's coming up. So these kind of things where we are able to leverage and know our roles, our respective roles in the international system, and play it according to that, so that there are we can take advantage of different countries. Like Japan is a big financier, has the resources, but does not have the same kind of human resource capacity that we may bring to developing countries. So we need to use that.
Let me now turn to Africa with you. This time, I think probably for the first time, India has done some sort of norm setting and engagement. And Prime Minister announced a 10-point principled charter for India's engagement with Africa. Lot of issues came up during his visit, but largely if you see the content of the 10-point agenda, it focuses on respecting sovereignty, bringing in priority areas as agriculture, but top is their own priority engagement, what they think, what is the very idea of South-South cooperation, which is demand-driven. So what kind of demands Africa has? How you view India's engagement with Africa this year?
See, India has had a very traditional relationship with Africa and a historical partnership, and somehow we, I think, got wrapped in those sloganeering over the last few decades. And I think now what we are witnessing is a more pragmatic engagement as to what are the drivers of this newfound relationship going forward. More proactive, more positive, as you point out, more demand driven. And there is a context to it where we are looking at other actors also playing a role, and India defining its new role in Africa. And I think that is very positive if you are looking at it from Africans' perspective. It is also positive if you are looking at it from New Delhi's perspective, which wants to have a new entry point into a continent which is going to be the cutting edge of the next stage of economic development, global economic development.
And by the way, in the G20, India with Japan is supporting that a sort of resolution for many countries. And this is one of the areas that Japan has proposed.
And that is an area where you were talking about trilateral partnerships, with regard to Japan, we are talking with the European Union, for example, in their new EU strategy for India. Africa is talked about as a potential area where India and EU can potentially work together into developing exactly the kind of norms that you talk about, because after all, you are also positioning yourselves towards the other actors who are coming with a different set of norms, which may not be as potentially positive for Africa and for the world.
How the scenario would look like now, many of these emerging economies, which were somewhere part of the Outreach 5, are now very much on the table and are playing in their own right some sort of norm setting. Do you see this role getting more escalated in the years to come?
Absolutely. If you look at the whole idea that America is drawing inwards and Europe is consumed by its domestic internal problems, I think this is a time when some of these countries, including India, will have to take on this role with greater sense of urgency. Because if India and this government came to power saying that we want to be a leading power in the international order, not being defined by others, but defining the terms of engagement for others. So I think that's in line with that reality that we have accepted.
Mr. Mukherjee, how you see this possibility? Do we have wherewithals? Do we have the right ecosystem to get into the norm setting exercise, and how it would play out?
Well, I think that in terms of the intellectual resources, we do possess the intellectual resources for norm setting. In fact, many of our partner countries in the developing world partner with us because we provide this depth of intellectual resources. What is new now for us is to leverage the emerging realities which you mentioned and which Professor Pant mentioned of the changes that have taken place within the developing world. There are many more developing countries now who themselves are more able and have more resources to bring to the table. So it is now an opportunity for us and in partnership with them to not only articulate but also set the norms for the international order that we want to see in the 21st century. And I think that where we should start this whole exercise should be with the UN Security Council reform.
Exactly, and you have been our permanent representative in New York. How you see UN reforms and India's this emerging role as norm setter?
Well, I think the core issue of UN Security Council reform is actually the question of the veto. I think for a long time, a lot of people have been distracted by this issue of how many people should sit around the table, whether a country like India or Japan or Brazil or South Africa should be there or not there. I think that is just distraction which has been focused upon with the support of the permanent members who do not want the focus to come to the core issue, which is the question of the veto. And it is interesting that in 2008, the General Assembly has actually passed a decision which includes the question of the veto in the reform of the Security Council. So I think that it is now time for us to take the leadership, to take the bull by the horns and address the question of whether the veto is anachronism in the 21st century and whether it should be replaced by majority voting, which is the norm in all other international institutions where India has been a member. And this is what most of the other countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, wish to see.
Yep.
They do not want new vetoes to arrive on the table. So I think this is a chance for us.
Yeah, we are running out of time. Sreeram, what's your one-liner for 2019?
2019, we must spend more on defense, Sachin. I believe that our defense diplomacy has been outstanding, all these multilateral agreements and joint exercise and so on. But defense spending as a percentage after general elections, we need to do more.
I think that 2019 will be the year for us to focus on the importance of international cooperation. That is something we cannot shy away from.
Yeah. Professor Pant?
Well, China is the big red flag because we don't really know which way it will pan out given the sort of internal problems and external problems that it is facing at the moment. So we should concentrate.
So China is the big elephant in the room. We would have to see how in 2019 it goes. But as Ambassador Mukherjee said, development cooperation would be the key, and Sreeram emphasizes on defense. With this, we come to end of this episode. I wish you all very best for 2019. We would be back next week, same time. Till then, a very goodbye and Happy New Year.